Welcome to The Explainer. So, picture this. It's 1945. The world's deadliest war is finally over, and the victors, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, are celebrating together. But, behind all those parades, a huge icy crack was already starting to form. So how did these wartime allies turn into sworn enemies and end up splitting an entire continent right down the middle?
I mean, think about it. The Grand Alliance fought together to crush fascism. But once their common enemy was gone, they were left staring at this enormous question. How do you even begin to rebuild the continent that's just been shattered? And maybe more importantly, whose idea of the future is going to win out?
And that was the real problem, wasn't it? They had totally different answers to that question. It was this fundamental clash of worldviews, really, born from completely different histories and completely different fears about what was coming next.
Yeah, it all boiled down to two very different ideas of what security even means. For the Soviet Union, a country that had been invaded from the West twice in just 30 years, security meant a physical shield, a buffer zone of friendly nations. But for the U.S., security meant something else entirely. It meant prosperity, freedom, a Europe full of independent democratic countries that you could trade with. These two visions, well, they were on a collision course. You have to understand, from Moscow's perspective, this wasn't some aggressive land grab. It was about survival. After losing tens of millions of people to invasion, building a defensive wall of allied states seemed like the only logical way to solve a horrible, recurring problem.
For Stalin, this buffer zone idea, it was completely non-negotiable. He just believed that a ring of pro-Soviet governments was absolutely essential for keeping his country safe. And here's the fascinating part. He had some pretty good reasons to think his Western allies had already given him the go-ahead.
This wasn't some kind of secret plot hatched in the dark. These ideas were talked about pretty openly during the war. At the Tehran conference, Churchill himself actually used matchsticks on a map to show how Poland's borders could be shifted around. And sure, they all used the word democracy at Yalta, but what that word meant to Stalin was wildly different from what it meant to Churchill and Truman.
The pragmatism is just astonishing. In 1944, in Moscow, Churchill and Stalin basically carved up the Balkans like it was a business deal. Romania? 90% Soviet influence. Okay, in exchange, Greece would be 90% British. To Stalin, this wasn't just talk, it was a firm deal. It basically confirmed his belief that he had a green light to build his sphere of influence.
So, thinking he had the West's blessing, Stalin started to lock down control using a strategy that people started calling salami slicing. In places like Romania, Poland, and Hungary, they just gradually carved away all the other political parties, slice by slice, until only the Moscow-backed communists were left standing.
This quote, something he said in private about Poland's future, is just chilling. It reveals his real game plan. Public promises? They didn't really matter. Stalin was going to secure his buffer zone his way, no matter what.
So, as one country after another came under Soviet domination, you can bet the alarm bells were starting to go off in the West. And this growing sense of dread, well, it was about to get a very powerful and unforgettable name from a very famous ally.
After losing the election after the war, a now private citizen, Winston Churchill, travels to Fulton, Missouri of all places. And there, he gives a speech that would just echo for decades. He gave the world this stark, unforgettable image for the new dividing line in Europe. The metaphor was just perfect. It instantly conjures up this image of something heavy, cold, impenetrable, and final. And just like that, the West had a name for this new, frightening reality. An iron curtain had fallen.
And Churchill wasn't just trying to be poetic here. He was spelling out the grim facts. These ancient, historic capitals, they were now, as he said, inside the Soviet sphere. They were being run by police governments, with all the strings being pulled from Moscow and with absolutely no room for what the West would call true democracy.
Well, the reaction from Moscow was furious. Stalin didn't hear a concerned warning in Churchill's words. No, he heard a hostile, aggressive call to arms. He actually compared Churchill to Hitler and called him a warmonger. So the speech, it didn't just give the divide a name, it made it deeper and wider.
So look, Churchill's speech didn't create this division, but it sure made it official.
Any pretense, any last shred of hope that the old wartime alliance was still a thing, it was gone. The world was now on notice, the alliance was over. And right here, this is the absolute heart of the whole conflict. You had two sides, looking at the exact same set of facts and seeing a completely different threat. Moscow looked and saw a defensive shield to protect it from invasion. Washington looked and saw an aggressive empire stamping out freedom. In each other's eyes, the other guy was the aggressor.
And this kicked off a very clear chain reaction. First, you have Soviet expansion. That triggers Churchill's warning. And that warning then cements the American policy that would basically define the entire world for the next 40 years.
America's big answer was a policy called containment. It came from a diplomat named George Kennan, and his whole idea was that, yes, the Soviet Union was expansionist, but it would probably back down if it was met with firm resistance. So the goal wasn't to, go in and destroy communism, but just to contain it, keep it from spreading. And that was that. The hopeful moment right after the war, it was officially over. The alliance was dead, and in its place were two hostile camps, led by two superpowers that saw each other as a threat to their very existence. The Cold War had begun.
Which leaves us with the massive question that historians are still fighting over today. Was there any way to avoid this, or were these two powerful opposing visions for the world just always destined to collide the second their common enemy was gone?